Welcome to Petra! I'm so excited to get started on this quilt pattern with you. So you can see on the left hand side I have everything cut and ready to go, and I usually label all of my cuts and piles so that way I don't get lost. And then we're going to start with pinning each of our strip sets together, and once we pin our strip sets together we will move on to sewing them in the next step. Something to help you with your strip sets is just to make sure that your cutting is very accurate, that your seam allowances are very accurate, and that will help later on when you are piecing the rest of your quilt top together. Now that we've finished with pinning all of our strip sets together, we're going to move on to sewing. I usually sew at like a 1.8 mm for my strip sets, just to make sure that the threads don't come undone when I am subcutting it later on. Totally up to you. You can also see that I have my lovely rifle paper. I love this washi tape, it's amazing. But I always have a guide, a scant 1/4 inch guide when I am sewing strip sets. And honestly, even when I just start a quilt in general, and I try to stick with that guide for the entire quilt, even though it kind of peels up sometimes. It helps me maintain an even, consistent seam allowance throughout the entire quilt process. So you can see I've sewn it onto that middle piece, and then I'm going to sew on the opposite side as well. And then we will move on to ironing our strip sets open. Let's get started with ironing our strip sets. So I have sewn all of the strip sets together at this point. They're off to the side there. And now we will get started with pressing. So what's really important is that you don't warp the fabric or push or pull the fabric in the wrong direction. Otherwise all of your strip sets are going to end up being wonky, and we do not want that. We want each subcut strip set to be perfectly straight. Well, it doesn't have to be perfect, but the more perfect it is, the easier it's going to be later on. So once we have pressed this down, then we will start subcutting. Now I pressed this towards the darker fabric, and that was more of an aesthetic decision. Sometimes I press it out and sometimes I press it in, but for this quilt I actually chose to press towards the darker fabric for almost the entire thing. But you feel free to press open for strip sets or press to outward as well. So now that we have, we've sewn all of our strip sets together, we have ironed them flat, we're going to start subcutting our strip sets. And this is really the magic of using strip piecing, because it just creates a lot of units, identical units, very quickly, which is honestly why I love it. Now, you will notice something, maybe not, but these squares are wrong. So the squares in the last bit, the darker tan one should actually be smaller. That is I think it's a 2-inch strip, or even, let's see, actually, yeah, it's a 2-inch strip, and all the other narrow strips are actually 2 1/4. So I had to go back and actually recreate all of the centers for that block. Thankfully, I didn't have to do that with any of the other strip sets, so just that part. So if you go back, you can see the mistake that I made. And probably because I was just in the zone and completely forgot that. I mean, I wrote this pattern and I still forgot that strip was only 2 inches. So just keep that in mind. Now you will notice that I very carefully line up these, and this is a big block. So these are really long strip sets, but again, they will save you so much time in the future. And they're really fun to make, especially when you are piecing your blocks later on. Next, we're going to move on to actually working on the centers of each block, which is super fun. Let's get started with sewing our block centers. So you will notice I hadn't fixed these block centers yet, which means that every single one of these had a little tail that I eventually had to trim off. Don't be like me. Just make that strip 2 inches instead of 2 1/4. So there's like a 1/4 inch tail on all of these. But anyways, the best way to do this that I have found is just by chain piecing, which I just have 2 piles in front of me and I pull them up put them together, and then I just keep going. Can you see the pile in the back there? And this quilt really chain pieces well. And in some ways, I'm sorry, because there's so much chain piecing that it gets a little, it can get a little tedious, but it also goes by very quickly, which is really nice. So this whole quilt top can come together really in just a few days, which is really nice. So I am, again, following my seam allowance guide, making sure that it is very accurate with this type of quilt, especially with log cabin piecing. You want everything to be extremely consistent, and that way, as you build out, there's no inconsistencies anywhere. So we're gonna keep sewing until all of those centers are done, depending on what size you'd like to make. Now that we have finished, so we finished our little centers, just that little, it created a little square. We're gonna press those open, and you can press the seams out, you can press them to the side, or even open, that will work. We're gonna move on to adding the 2 side strips. So on the sides you will add 2 strips, and you can see here that's what I'm doing. And then we will press them open, and I will show you what that looks like. Again, I'm chain piecing these because it's just so much faster that way. So this is usually how I build the quilt out. Each block you'll create that center, and then you'll add the 2 side strips, and then we'll move on to the next step. And in between each sewing step, you will press open. Let's go through some of the rest of the construction for this block. So the main center block is really, it's very simple. So we take our 2 from our strip cutting, and one of them is smaller. This one is normal 2 1/4, and this one's smaller. We're gonna take that, and we're actually gonna sew it on to this strip right here. And this is my favorite part. This is the actual kind of log cabin piecing. Once that's done, I usually make sure that this is nice and square. And then we're gonna add on the bottom and the top. And now remember, there are two different sides. I'll show you what this looks like. I messed this up. I wrote this pattern and I messed it up when I was testing it. So do you see how there is one going this direction and there's one going this direction? For the throw, you're gonna have 24 of each because there's 12 blocks, so just double. And then I can't remember for the crib or the twin, just follow those directions there. But just make sure that you're doing 2 different sides for that. And then what you're gonna do is sew this in between, and that is going to turn into this right here. You can see kind of what it looks like. Once you've done this, then you can start sewing on your center piece. It's like a center strip cut. And once you've sewn that on, I'll show you what that looks like. You're going to sew on an identical mirror side to the top. So you have your full half block. This is your one of your strip cutting pieces, one of your strip set pieces, and then this is another full block sewn on, and then I ironed it flat. And what we're going to do now is start sewing on the edges using, this is the 16 1/4 onto the edges here. We finished the interior of the block, and we reserved 4 of these centers, and those centers will not get these. These are color C strips. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to iron these flat because I just sewed on all of these strips right here. And once I have ironed those on, then I will go through and attach the various strip sets that I need to at the top. And so I will attach those next. And then I will actually start assembling the quilt, which is so exciting and will come together so fast because these blocks are really giant. So I will show you what that looks like. And just a tip as you're going is that I have squared these little sections after every single every time I sew something together, I go through and I make sure that it's square before I sew on the next strip. So with log cabin piecing, I found that to be the most effective way to keep everything from getting wonky. So with these pieces, the more you build, if something's off, then the rest of it's gonna be off too. So I always go through and I ensure that this is square, and then I made sure that this was square before I sewed on this, and then I made sure that these were square, and then I actually squared the whole interior before sewing on these side strips as well. And I don't take off a lot. I mean, I actually take off as minimal as possible. I take off just enough to make it straight and square with the rest of the block. So I will get started with that and I'll show you what's next. I will show you what I'm doing now. I am adding the top strip sets. And then you might have a few extra because remember, you're going to put a few on the bottom to complete the quilt at the very end when you're sewing your last blocks together. So if you're worried because you have a few extra strips, that's why. Okay, we're so close to being done. Basically, now that we have a bajillion of these ginormous blocks, we're going to assemble them into our quilt top, and I'm so excited. So first what I do is I set the seam, is what it's called, by ironing it flat, and then I open up that strip set edition, the unit on the top there that I'm currently ironing flat. And then I will show you what all of the other blocks look like. So that is another center block and another top center block. I'm so excited to get them all assembled. Okay, I apologize. I was in the middle of moving when I finished Petra, but this is what all of the blocks will look like. And I pinned all of the rows together. After sewing the blocks into rows, I pinned them all together and I will sew them down each of those seams, as you'll see, and I try to match the points. And next I will show you what it looks like hanging up on my wall. I'm so excited to show you. This is almost finished. You'll notice it is missing those side strips, but I think it looks amazing. I love Petra. I can't wait to make another one. I think I'm gonna do like a navy blue, maybe a dark version, but I hope you enjoyed this quilt as much as I had fun designing it. Thanks for joining me.